hello. It's Spooky Lake Month. Yes, hello. It's October 1st. Do you know what that means? It's Spooky Lake Month, where we do 31 days of haunted hydrology. And today, I want to talk about this strange lake in the heart of the Louisiana Bayou. Located on the coast of the Gulf of Mexico, alongside the sprawling mouth of the Mississippi River, lies Lake Pontchartrain. However, because it's open to the ocean, resulting in a mix of freshwater and salty, it's actually more of an estuary. Its brackish waters not only have giant freshwater alligators, but also manatees and bull sharks. But I know you were asking yourself, what's the giant line in the middle of the lake? This is the Lake Pontchartrain Causeway, just under 24 miles of concrete, making it the longest continuous bridge over water in the world. Constructed in 1955, the bridge rests on some 9,500 concrete pilings which were driven into the shallow lake bed. When you reach the middle of the bridge, you're surrounded by water on all sides with no land in sight. For most, this is a daily commute, but for some, it's the last bridge they will ever cross. Countless accidents have occurred on the causeway, with 12 people losing their lives between 1993 and 2016. This doesn't even include the bus that went over the edge in 1964, resulting in 6 people drowning in just 15 feet of water. It becomes even more deadly when there's bad weather or, even worse, dense fog on the road. Just last December, there was a 70-car pileup that was a result of extremely dense fog. Much of the land surrounding Lake Pontchartrain is swampy, filled with cypress trees and black water channels. Many of these waterways were cut into the swamp by loggers in the early 1900s. By the 1920s, the vast majority of old-growth cypress in southeast Louisiana had vanished. Without these swamp forests, the coastline lost a crucial buffer against erosion and storm surge. This area is considered one of the most vulnerable places in the United States when it comes to hurricanes. Lake Pontchartrain acts as something of a runway for storm surge coming in from the Gulf. New Orleans is guarded by levees and floodwalls, but during the 2005 Hurricane Katrina, these defenses failed. Lake Pontchartrain's storm-driven waters poured into the city, completely submerging entire neighborhoods. Because many of these suburbs are below sea level, the water did not simply drain away. Instead, it pooled in low-lying neighborhoods, trapping residents in their homes for over 43 days after the storm had already passed. Images of submerged homes and bodies in the water remain some of the darkest memories in American history. Lake Pontchartrain's murky, brackish waters hide a grim underbelly and a legacy of death. 6 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month, where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology, and today I want to talk about these strange concrete portals located alongside dams. They're a certain type of spillway that's often referred to as a glory hole. There are many different types of spillways or overflow channels, all engineered to help dams release excess water from the reservoirs that they're holding back. And while all spillways have the capacity to kill, I want to focus on the ones constructed in the shape of an upside-down bell that have a passage attached underneath. Many can be found around the world, such as Cuvão dos Conchos, which is located in Portugal. Over the course of 60 years, vegetation grew around the mouth of this spillway, making it a strange type of tourist attraction. However, I think the most famous one, and the one with a history of death, is located at Lake Berryessa in California. This reservoir is one of over 1,300 in the state of California. Construction on the Monticello Dam started in 1953, after which it took 5 years to fill the reservoir behind the dam to its full capacity. The spillway is designed to be utilized during times of flooding when the reservoir is above capacity. And since its completion, this spillway has only been utilized 28 times, the most recent being February of this year. But you've probably been wondering, where does the water even go? Beneath this opening, which is 72 feet in diameter, which is large enough to comfortably fit a semi-truck laying on its side, There's a 200-foot drop into this large concrete pipe, which funnels its way beneath the dam. When the spillway is dry, people illegally explore this giant opening. But don't be fooled, at full capacity, this type of tunnel can harness some pretty incredible and dangerous power. In 1977, a tragedy occurred here that continues to haunt Lake Berryessa to this day. During a particularly wet spring, crowds had formed along the edge of the reservoir to witness the spillway in action. Fascination with an engineering marvel quickly turned to horror as onlookers watched as a 41-year-old woman inexplicably entered the water. Accounts differ, but witnesses say she entered the water fully clothed, and whether deliberately or not, she drifted towards the spillway. The water was apparently moving quite fast, and she was quickly sucked to the edge of the opening. From there, she clung onto the rim for 20 agonizing minutes before losing her strength and falling into the abyss. In the aftermath, news outlets reported conflicting stories, and none of them ever reported whether her body had been found. To this day, that is the only known death that's occurred at the spillway, with the exception of the occasional bird that disappears into the depths. Maybe these spillways are actually a portal to the underworld. 7 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology. And you know what topic I've never done in 5 years? Submarines. You know what's really terrifying? Submarines. Just to go over the basics, you are hundreds, if not thousands of feet below the surface, sealed inside of a pressurized steel tube with no windows, no fresh air, no sunrise, and no sunset. Being surrounded by the ocean on all sides means that even the smallest accident can be fatal for the entire crew. Fire on land is dangerous, but on a submarine it can be catastrophic. The smoke will have nowhere to go, and heat spreads through the steel walls, making this like a giant oven. And this actually happened to a Soviet sub in 1989. Then there's the submarine's crush depth. This is the point where the pressure becomes so great that the hull collapses inwards in a catastrophic explosion, similar to the Ocean Gate disaster. However, can you imagine this happening to a giant military submarine? Well, that's exactly what happened in 1963 to the USS Thresher. During a deep-sea diving test, the submarine experienced mechanical failure, which led to flooding and loss of power. From there, it sank below its crush depth, imploding and instantly killing all 129 men aboard. The idea of submarines has been around for a long time, with some of the ones in the 1600s being controlled by a hand crank, and others that had a bomb at the end of a stick. But everything really changed in World War II, where Germany pioneered the military use of the U-boat. However, these diesel-powered vessels were slow and they had to come up for air, so they could only stay underwater for 48 hours or less. Enter the nuclear subs of the Cold War. That's right, these submarines had tiny nuclear reactors on them. Maybe tiny is a misrepresentation, they're still pretty big. This new type of submarine does not require air, which means in theory it could stay underwater for up to 25 years. However, technically impossible because that would make this an underwater prison and you'd have no way of getting food for your crew. The longest mission ever conducted was still really long. It was 140 days back in 2014. While the technology was still new, one of the worst nuclear submarine disasters happened in 1961. Soviet K-19 submarine suffered a complete loss of coolant in one of its 2 reactors on board. The captain ordered the engineering crew to find a solution before they experienced a nuclear meltdown. The only way to stop it was to jerry-rig a coolant system, but this meant that the engineers had to go into the reactor compartment, which was flooded with lethal radiation. 8 men sacrificed themselves and died within weeks of acute radiation sickness. Over the next 2 years, another 14 crew members would die from radiation-linked sicknesses. And while the submarine survived, it was nicknamed Hiroshima. I don't really feel finished with this topic because I didn't even get to the abandoned nuclear reactors in submarines at the bottom of the ocean that are currently corroding away in the saltwater. So for now, 10 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology, and today I want to talk about what might be the most dangerous stretch of water in New England. The Huntington Gorge is located in the state of Vermont, somewhat close to the border with Montreal. Locals like to call it the Hungry Gorge, and it's earned its nickname. Since 1950, some 26 people have lost their lives here, but some say the true number is closer to 40. For generations, people have come here to swim in the deep pools carved into the ravine, or for those daring to jump from the cliffs above it. However, not all of them have made it safely back to the surface. A grim wooden sign near the trailhead lists the names and dates of those who have been lost, but the tally ends in 1994 and it hasn't been updated. Whether it's slipping on slick rocks while trying to peer down into the frothing pools, or breaking a neck while taking a high dive, or even unassumingly wandering into the most dangerous parts of the gorge, the result is the same. All of this is of course made worse if there's flooding and the rock is slick. Beneath the surface, there are pockets that have been carved into the rock, which, along with a strong current, could keep your body trapped at the bottom. If you fall into a churning section of the gorge, then you're not only fighting potentially strong currents, but also aerated water, which robs you of buoyancy. Bodies have been found wedged into narrow chutes or swept deep beneath ledges, some taking days to recover. Locals have attempted to tame the gorge, such as one event in 1976 where they actually blasted away an underwater chute that had been trapping swimmers. However, accidents have continued, and in 2005, a man actually bought the land to keep it open for future generations. But depending on who you ask, this either means future enjoyment or future fatalities. And just downstream at the Bolton potholes, the story repeats itself. These inviting emerald pools have claimed the lives of some 16 people, with many more needing unexpected rescue. All of the known drownings at Bolton potholes have happened at the Eagle Eye Pool, where the water is frothy and aerated, challenging even the strongest of swimmers. The Huntington Gorge and its deadly neighbor are twin scars on the Vermont landscape, where beauty and death run side by side. 5 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology, and considering that 8 more houses just fell into the ocean this week, we need to talk about the Outer Banks. Along almost the entire coast of North Carolina, the Outer Banks are a fragile string of barrier islands that have almost always been struggling to stay above water. The current chaos unfolding here is no coincidence. It's the same force that earned this place its nickname, the Graveyard of the Atlantic. There are more than 5,000 shipwrecks just off the coast here. Everything from pirate ships and Spanish galleons to Civil War-era ironclads and World War II freighters. Even Blackbeard's own ship, the Queen Anne's Revenge, ran ashore here in 1718. But these wrecks aren't just bad luck, they're the result of an ever-shifting landscape. The Outer Banks are almost completely made of sand, which are always moving, eroding, and rebuilding. The sand you see in the shallow areas of the water is known as a shoal. The gentle slope of the continental shelf here makes it easier for sand to be pushed up from deeper waters. Wave and tidal action then move all of that sand around in shallow areas, making it unpredictable for sailors who are trying to navigate here. To add to the mix, this is where the warm, fast-moving waters from the Gulf Stream converge with the cold Labrador Current. So the water can be incredibly turbulent here without even having a hurricane. Combined with the ever-shifting ocean floor, you get shipwrecks. However, these days the ocean isn't just satisfied with ships, now it's coming for houses. When waves approach the beach on an angle, it carries sand and sediment up the beach in a zigzag pattern. This is called longshore drift. Over many years, this process can move entire beaches. In this picture, you can see where the shoreline used to be in 1852. Look, they even had to move this lighthouse before it was eaten by the sea. So these houses were not built onto the beach, they were built behind a protective wall of dunes. However, rising seas and constant erosion have eaten away at those protections. Over the last 4 years, at least 24 homes have been utterly destroyed by these natural forces. And while some of these homes are demolished before the sea can take them, most leave behind splintered debris and miles of wreckage, not to mention what got sucked into the ocean. The graveyard of the Atlantic isn't just for ships anymore. 6 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology. Today, I want to talk about the longest man-made river in the world, which flows beneath the Sahara Desert. Covering around 31% of the African continent, the Sahara Desert spans an area roughly the size of the United States. However, around 10,000 years ago, the Sahara was green, and there were enormous freshwater lakes such as Lake Megachad and Lake Megafazan. You can still find remnants of these lakes today in these scattered, salty oases. They're fed by a fossil aquifer beneath the surface, where the water could be anywhere between 20,000 and 1,000,000 years old. The largest fossil aquifer in the world is the Nubian Sandstone Aquifer, which is beneath Egypt, Libya, Sudan, and Chad. However, we didn't even know about it until the 1950s, when oil drillers in Libya unexpectedly came across freshwater. This discovery gave rise to one of the largest engineering projects in human history, costing somewhere around $25 billion. It's known as the Great Man-Made River Project, where these enormous concrete pipelines were buried in the desert throughout much of the country of Libya. This vast network spans more than 1,700 miles into the desert's interior. Building it required 5 million tons of cement and enough steel wire to circle the entire planet over 280 times. The river provides 70% of all of the water used in the country, and they use the water to grow crops in this extremely harsh environment. After being built over the course of decades, the Libyan government claimed that it was the 8th wonder of the world. The project was far cheaper than building desalination plants along the Mediterranean coast, but these savings came at a great cost. It relies on a non-renewable source of water that will one day run dry. There's also no clear consensus on how long this ancient aquifer will provide water. Libyan officials once claimed that it would last for thousands of years. However, independent experts warn that at current extraction rates, it could actually be less than 100. Either way, this concrete river is running backwards through time, towards extinction rather than renewal. 4 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology, and today we need to talk about a deadly water park in New Jersey. Action Park opened in 1978 and consisted of 3 smaller parks: Motor World, Alpine Center, and Water World. This was one of the first modern-day water parks to open in the United States. However, it quickly garnered the nickname Traction Park or Class Action Park because of the carnage that took place here. The park was notorious for underage and undertrained staff, with drunk guests and rides that were designed with more intuition than actual engineering. At least 6 people are known to have died here, with many more leaving with injuries, lawsuits, or lifelong trauma. The water world aspect of Action Park is known to have caused the most injuries and death. The most infamous ride might have been Cannonball Loop, which was an enclosed water slide that had a physics-defying loop near the bottom. Test dummies came out missing limbs, and park employees had to be bribed with $100 just to give it a try. Now just imagine going down this slide in pitch black darkness, and when you hit that curve, your legs are suddenly above your head and you're flying around it. People were coming out of the other side of the ride with lacerations and bruising. And not everybody made it around this actual loop, some crashing backwards into the fiberglass at full speed. However, when some riders started turning up with gashes on their body, they had to go into the water slide to figure out the cause. They discovered that previous riders had had their teeth knocked out, and they were lodged in the walls of the water slide, then slicing open the next riders that came through. But that wasn't the only dangerous thing found at Waterworld. There was the Tarzan swing, which would land you in a pool fed by a spring, which meant that the water was around 50 degrees Fahrenheit. It was so cold it could cause hypothermic shock, and somebody actually died of cardiac arrest after landing in the pool. The Roaring Rapids was a raft ride designed to mimic a whitewater rafting experience on a river. It included this ominous black tunnel where the lining on the inside would frequently tear loose, and there would be a pileup of human bodies until the staff could finally turn off the water. However, the most deadly attraction was the tidal wave pool, which was grimly nicknamed the Grave Pool. It was 100 feet wide, 250 feet long, and could easily fit up to 1,000 people. The waves, which were over 3 feet high, were generated by an underwater machine and would last around 20 minutes. There was often a densely packed layer of people in floating rings, which means that if someone got swept underneath, they could get trapped under the water. There were 12 lifeguards on duty, and they would have to rescue up to 30 people during a busy weekend. 3 people died in the tidal wave pool between 1982 and 1987. Action Park wasn't shut down by regulators, it actually just went bankrupt. By the early 1990s, over 2,400 lawsuits had been filed. But it turns out that the park had no real insurance. The owner just created a fake insurance company. By 1996, the most dangerous water park in the United States had finally drowned in its own chaos. However, it was still the inspiration for every water park that we have today. 8 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology. And today I want to talk about a nightmare that unfolded in a river in Australia. The Finniss River is located in Australia's Northern Territory along the coast of the Timor Sea. Like many rivers in this region, the Finniss River is a tidal river, which means that during high tide, salt water pushes inland, bringing with it bull sharks, stingrays, and sometimes box jellyfish. However, the king of the river and the creature that causes at least 2 deaths a year in this territory is, of course, the saltwater crocodile. The Finniss River is known for having these monster crocs, including an infamous one named Sweetheart that was 17 feet long and used to attack boats in the river. Locals know to stay out of murky water, but in 2003, a real-life horror movie unfolded here. It all started when 3 friends from a nearby coastal city spent the day riding their quad bikes on the salt flats located near the Finniss River. After hours of racing in the mud, they were covered in dirt and ready to go home, but one friend suggested they quickly rinse off. It had been a rainy and wet December, so the river was higher than it normally is. There were mangrove trees along the edge that were partially submerged in that high and fast-moving water. They waded through the mangroves until they found a small clearing, and holding on to the roots and branches, they tried to quickly wash off in the current. But the water was stronger than they expected, and one of the friends lost his grip and was swept away. His 2 friends jumped into the river after him, and within moments, all 3 of them were quickly moving downstream. They were desperately trying to find something to hold on to when one of them spotted something moving in the water. Scrambling to swim to a nearby tree, 2 of the friends made it safely into the branches before turning around and realizing the 3rd friend was missing. They watched as the surface broke and a massive saltwater crocodile rose up with its jaws locked around their friend's body. It stared at them for a few moments before sinking back into the murky water. The next 22 hours, that same crocodile stalked the 2 survivors from below their precarious perch. They recalled having to move higher up in the branches because the crocodile would lunge at them from below. To make matters worse, it stormed during the night, so they clung to the tree in the rain, freezing, exhausted, and terrified. After almost 24 hours, they were rescued by helicopter, which was the only thing that scared off the crocodile. Their friend's body was never found, and neither was the crocodile who did it. The Finniss River doesn't need ghosts to be haunted, because that's what the crocodiles are for. 6 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology. And today I want to talk about the most dangerous type of swimming hole, an abandoned quarry. A quarry is a slowly gaping pit used to harvest stone, slate, limestone, or gravel. There are upwards of 500,000 abandoned quarries and mines just in the United States. However, when the mining stops and the pumps are shut off, groundwater starts to seep back in and rain fills the open basin. Eventually, that pit becomes a lake, the deepest of which is over 800 feet deep in the state of New York. Each year, 20 to 30 people die in abandoned quarries and mines across the United States. These deaths usually come down to a handful of predictable and brutal hazards. Most quarries have near vertical walls or steeply shelving bottoms. A swimmer might step from the shallows into water that's potentially hundreds of feet deep. Those steep walls means that it could be incredibly easy to get in, but possibly incredibly hard to get out. Also, quarry walls are often fractured or undercut, meaning that a rockfall is a real possibility. And while that neon blue water can be inviting, it's usually a warning sign. Many of these pits used to be industrial sites, meaning that the water could be contaminated with heavy metals, acidic runoff, or even toxic chemicals. However, it's really what's below the water that might be the most concerning. Many of the quarries have old machinery, rebar, or even cars that have been left to rot. This can be a hazard for cliff divers who are jumping into these pits, but it can also be a veritable labyrinth for those brave enough to dive below. And nowhere has it been as dangerous for scuba divers than the Dorothea Quarry in North Wales. Dorothea Quarry opened in the early 1800s during the slate boom in Wales and officially closed in the 1970s when the pumps stopped working and the pits began to flood. Much of the original buildings are still on the grounds, except for they've been completely reclaimed by nature. At least 25 scuba divers have died at Dorothea Quarry since the early 90s. At Dorothea, most divers don't die from a single mistake. Instead, they die from several. It's over 300 feet deep with old machinery and twisted rebar scattered across the bottom. Like many other quarries, there's also a heap of rusted cars, their origins unknown, for divers to explore. This junkyard can tempt divers, but it can also snag hoses, tear suits, or trap limbs. Divers can also explore the tight mining tunnels that extend beneath the quarry. In these tight passages, if silt gets kicked up by a diver's fin, creating a cloud that lowers visibility, divers can become extremely disoriented. Dorothea is deep enough that it has a thermocline, which means it can get incredibly cold incredibly fast. Hypothermia or even mild cold stress can result in impaired judgment. Because of the sheer number of people who have died while diving here, it's actually illegal. And yet the most recent diving death here was in May of this year. 5 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology, and one thing you should probably know about this account is we love to talk about Lake Baikal. There's a local legend that the Russian mafia would dispose of human bodies in Lake Baikal because after 48 hours there'd be no flesh left behind, just bones. So today I want to talk about what would happen if you died in Lake Baikal. But first, in case you're new here, this lake is the oldest, deepest, and strangest lake on Earth. Isolated in the heart of Siberia, Lake Baikal is over a mile deep, and even though it's smaller than most of the North American Great Lakes, it has more water than all of these lakes combined. And unlike the Great Lakes, it's also had 25 million years to evolve a very strange ecosystem. Lake Baikal is the only truly deep lake on Earth that has oxygenated waters from top to bottom. I can't stress enough how unusual this is because deep lakes usually lose dissolved oxygen as they get deeper. That even happens in parts of the ocean. And the reason for this starts with the Baikal Rift Zone. This is where the Earth is literally tearing apart and the lake is getting wider and deeper every year. Because of that tectonic activity, Lake Baikal has hydrothermal vents, methane seeps, and even mud volcanoes at the very bottom. And we know this because scientists have gone down more than 5,000 feet in these tiny submersibles just to see them in person. Unlike the hot, belching black smokers at the bottom of the ocean, Lake Baikal's hydrothermal vents simmer quietly in the mud, releasing warm methane gases and minerals into the water. These are the same methane gases that make these amazing bubbles in the ice during the winter. And despite the darkness and the pressure, these vents are anything but lifeless. First, they're coated in these bacterial mats that feed on chemical energy instead of sunlight, creating the foundation for a food chain that's built on methane. You'll also find giant flatworms, crustaceans, and vent-loving fish thriving in the cold. These vents are also what helps circulate oxygen throughout the lake. You combine geothermal circulation plus near-freezing waters, which slows decay, plus deep convective mixing, you get an oxygenated abyss. And then you give it a couple million years and you end up with an ecosystem that's unlike any other on Earth. I think my favorite might be the transparent Golemyunka, which is a cannibalistic oily fish that makes up 70% of the fish mass in the entire lake. But then there's the 350 species of amphipod that live here. Just for comparison, usually a lake might have 1 or 2. They've also experienced gigantism here, so these scavenging little cuties can be the size of a rat. They're the main food source for the Baikal nirpa, which is one of the world's only freshwater seals. They're a species that's lived here for over 2 million years, but scientists can't really explain how they got here in the first place. All of this to say that this thriving ecosystem is actually the reason that you might not want to die here. If your body sank into Lake Baikal, it wouldn't bloat and float like it would in a warm freshwater lake. It also wouldn't be preserved like in other cold lakes that are lacking oxygen. Instead, as you descend to the abyss, there are a lot of things that would like to eat you. Probably not the nirpa, but instead thousands upon thousands of amphipods. These little guys could clean you down to the bone in just 48 hours. So while we're not sure if this is what the mafia did with their victims, it might actually be a smart way to dispose of a body. 9 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello. There's actually one more thing about Lake Baikal that I can't stop thinking about. It has to do with those hydrothermal vents that are some 4,000 feet below the surface. Scientists were shocked to discover an aquatic insect that lives near these vents. These insects are midges or flies. It looks a little bit like a mosquito. They're larvae, which are bright red because they're filled with hemoglobin so that they can store oxygen in this freezing environment. But they live in the mud around the vents, but then when they're finally ready to emerge, scientists actually think that they take a ride on the methane bubbles. So it's like they're taking an elevator made of gas because they ride these all the way up the water column to the surface. However, scientists don't know how the adults get back down to the bottom of the lake. But still, they're the deepest dwelling insect on the planet. At the bottom of Lake Baikal. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology. And if anybody ever asks me what the ultimate spooky lake is, this is the one I tell them about. On the morning of August 22nd, 1986, 1,746 people were found dead, along with all of their animals and their livestock, near the vicinity of Lake Nyos. Except for the deaths, everything in the area was normal. The grass was green, the skies were clear, and the houses remained undisturbed. Even the restless buzzing of insects had ceased, and the dead lay undisturbed by flies in the light of day. It was a long time after the village had gone quiet that scientists were able to piece together what had happened at Lake Nyos. After an eruption, when a volcano goes dormant, it usually leaves behind a giant crater that eventually will fill with water over time. Many of these crater lakes are quiet and peaceful, but some have a killer secret hidden beneath the surface. Lake Nyos is one such lake, cradled in the belly of an ancient volcano. And it might not look it, but it's almost 700 feet deep. Even if a volcano is dormant, it can still release gases, which usually just mix with the Earth's atmosphere or percolate up from the bottom of a shallow lake to the surface in the form of bubbles. However, in a much deeper lake, those bubbles of gas will dissolve into the water before they ever make it to the surface. The larger the volume of water in the lake means the larger the quantity of carbon dioxide that can be dissolved in the water at the bottom. All of this carbon dioxide gas built up over decades, and kind of like a soda can that's been shaken, Lake Nyos exploded on August 21st, 1986. A massive amount of carbon dioxide would have been released from Lake Nyos almost instantly. This gas is invisible and you can't smell it, and it's heavier than the surrounding air. So it would have flowed silently down the side of the Nyos volcano, moving at around 45 miles per hour. It crept into people's homes while they slept on the floor and silently suffocated them. This type of eruption is called a limnic eruption, and Lake Nyos is not the only crater lake susceptible to this. A similar disaster had occurred just a few years before this at Lake Manoon, killing 37 people. These types of deadly events are incredibly rare, but there might be more lakes on this planet that are hiding a secret stash of carbon dioxide in their depths. But for now, Lake Nyos is the only lake in the world that's killed thousands of living things with a single, silent, invisible breath. 10 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello. I'm actually not done thinking about this deadly lake in Cameroon that killed over 1,700 people, all of their animals and their livestock, and all the bugs in the area in 1986. Over the last 5 years, I've always called this Lake Nyos, but thanks to this comment from a local, it's actually pronounced Nyos. I only briefly mentioned that there are other lakes in the world that could experience this type of limnic eruption, where deadly carbon dioxide gas dissolves at the bottom of a lake and stays there until something disturbs it. In the case of Lake Nyos, a lot of people think it was a landslide that disturbed all of that built-up gas at the bottom. Some people asked what the actual eruption in the middle of the night would have looked like, and it would have been like millions of bubbles rising to the surface all at once, creating this boiling cauldron on the surface. In my illustration here, I'm showing the carbon dioxide gas, even though technically it's invisible. And the sudden upwelling of bubbles could have also created a massive tidal wave on the surface of the lake. Other people asked if lakes like Baikal or Crater Lake in Oregon could technically experience a limnic eruption. And even though Lake Baikal has gas, it experiences a turnover, so it's always circulating. The water column is like flipping over twice a year. Even though Crater Lake is volcanic, it doesn't have any gases coming up from the bottom, and it experiences a seasonal turnover. It's actually pretty rare for a lake to have all of the perfect conditions to even have a limnic eruption. It needs to be a very deep, stratified volcanic lake. The other big one that we're hyper aware of is Lake Kivu, which is 1,000 times larger than Lake Nyos. It's located along the African Rift Zone, along with all of my favorite African Great Lakes. And unlike Nyos, it has millions of people living on the shores, so a limnic eruption could be extremely deadly. However, this is where degassing comes in. So both for Nyos, Lake Manoon, and Lake Kivu, they have a degassing system set up. This is a vertical pipe from the bottom of the lake to the top that vents out any dangerous carbon dioxide gas that might be building up at the bottom. In Lake Kivu, they're also looking at ways that they can harness these natural gases. So my apologies for any oversimplification on this subject. I was just trying to keep the video efficient. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology. Today, I want to talk about a volcanic coastline on an island in the Atlantic Ocean that's claimed hundreds of lives in the last few decades. Tenerife is the largest of the Canary Islands located off the coast of Africa. They were created by a volcanic hotspot, and all of them are technically still volcanically active. The most recent volcano to erupt was on the island of La Palma in 2021. This lava is what constructs some of the most dangerous coastlines here. Between 2016 and 2022, some 500 people have died by drowning in the Canary Islands. However, some of the most brutal deaths recorded were along the lava-sculpted coast in Tenerife. Some of these pools, both natural and unnatural, invite swimmers in with ladders and stairs carved into the lava. But that doesn't mean they're safe. During high tide or during an upward swell, you can get an unexpected wave that crashes into the side of these pools. And what happens is people can get sucked over the edge into the open ocean, where they're then trapped in the continual waves, smashing them against the side of the rough lava coastline. The current can also suck you out into the ocean, where if you're lucky, you'll be rescued. However, that's not always the outcome for people who end up in this unfortunate position. While all of these natural pools have the potential to be deadly under the right circumstances, I think Cueve del Tancón might be the most dangerous of them all. During low tide or calm waters, this pool can be deceiving. Surrounded by these hexagonal columnar basalts, there are many convenient spots to jump into the water. However, it's not a very large opening, so people have missed the pool and hit the rock instead. This pool is connected directly to the open ocean through tunnels and caverns beneath the water. In case you have trouble climbing out of the mouth of this pool, there's an accessible grotto beneath a shelf in the rock. However, even inside of the grotto, it can be difficult to actually get out of the water. Visitors who jump in or climb down to swim might not realize that every wave on the outside is funneling straight towards them. A woman who had a life and death experience here described jumping in just as the cave began to empty, and she was sucked beneath the rock out into the open ocean. 7 people have died here in recent memory, and many more have had to be rescued. In fact, Cueva del Tancón is so dangerous that it's now illegal to swim there, but despite this, somebody has already lost their life there this year. 3 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month, where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology. And today, I want to talk about a claustrophobic cave diving disaster that happened inside of a radioactive cave. Radium Springs is located on the outskirts of Albany in Georgia. There's around 70,000 gallons of water flowing from the spring every minute. However, that neon blue is from the trace elements of radium that can be found in the water. Radium is a naturally occurring radioactive metal that can be found in the limestone and dolomite bedrock around Radium Springs. In the early 1900s, radium was seen as a miracle element, a glowing cure-all. Radium-infused water, tonics, and elixirs were promised to cure everything from arthritis to epilepsy. When radium was discovered here, it became a hot destination for people to swim and cure their ailments. One of the weirdest things about radium is that it's like calcium. When it gets into your body, it's absorbed by your bones where it can remain for decades. Radium Springs only has trace elements of this radioactive metal dissolved in its waters, so it would take years of drinking from it before you would have any serious health effects. And this spicy water didn't deter divers from exploring the labyrinth of caves beneath the surface. In the summer of 1955, Lieutenant Murray Anderson was determined to map out the cave system here. Cave diving in the 1950s was extremely experimental, with heavy primitive gear and almost no rules. Anderson and his friend Donald Garou entered the 3-foot opening to the cave with their homemade diving rig and oxygen tanks and a couple flashlights. They didn't run a safety guideline, which today is common practice, and they split up to explore different sections of the cave system. There were some parts of the dive that were so tight they had to remove their air tanks to squeeze through. Since they didn't know where they were going, they also sometimes had to turn around in these tight passages. Around 200 feet into the tunnels, Donald Garou indicated to Murray Anderson that he wanted to turn around, but Anderson decided to keep going alone. Continuing on, his homemade flashlight began to dim, and he had inadvertently agitated some of the sediment on the cave floor. Kicking up silt is one of the worst things that can happen while cave diving because it can limit visibility and cause divers to panic. We don't know what Murray Anderson's last moments looked like, but he died in an uncharted cave in silty darkness with no guideline to lead him out. Back at the surface, Donald Garou was increasingly concerned for his friend, and he called for backup. They arrived after darkness and spent hours trying to navigate this honeycomb cave system. However, at this point, there was such bad kicked up sediment that there was terrible visibility. This was the first known cave diving death that occurred in the United States, and a Navy team flew out the next morning for a body recovery. They found him at the exact point that Donald and his diving friends had looked for him the previous night. He was floating near the roof of the cave, which means that his friends were swimming back and forth below him, just feet from his corpse. Cave diving rules were created because of Murray Anderson's death, and diving at Radium Springs is now illegal without special permission. A deadly dip in a radioactive cave system is 7 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month, where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology, and today I want to talk about the ocean's quietest grave, the whale fall. After death, a whale doesn't sink to the bottom of the ocean right away. Instead, it floats to the surface, buoyed by gases released during the decomposition process. For days or even weeks, it drifts through the currents, feeding sharks and seabirds until the gases finally escape. Slowly, it begins to sink through the darkness to the sea floor, where the first stages of its new life begin. Normally, these deep-sea parts of the ocean rely on something called marine snow, which is organic and inorganic material that falls down from the surface. So a whale fall is like a pop-up shop for these deep-sea scavenging creatures, creating a temporary oasis that could last for decades after the whale has actually died. However, this afterlife unfolds in stages, each one stranger than the last. The mobile scavenger stage is when larger predators like sharks, crabs, and hagfish will strip away hundreds of pounds of flesh in a matter of months. bits of tissue and oil will seep into the surrounding sediment, drawing in the opportunists. Worms, crustaceans, and microbes move in on the carcass, ready to feed on what's left for up to 5 years. In the third stage, sulfophilic bacteria begins to feast on the fats that are locked in the bones. However, these bacteria don't use oxygen. Instead, they breathe in dissolved sulfate and exhale hydrogen sulfide, which is a gas deadly to most marine life. Now, due to this toxic environment, only chemosynthetic bacteria, which is resistant to hydrogen sulfide, can survive. But these bacterial mats provide nourishment for clams, mussels, limpets, and sea snails. This is also when these zombie worms move in on the grave, here to eat the whalebone from the inside out. These Osidax worms dissolve the bone with a strong acid. However, they have no mouth and no stomach. Instead, they rely on a symbiotic bacteria that live inside of their bodies to do the digesting for them. Together, they feast on the last vestiges of life. After decades, the bones have one last gift to give. At this final stage, the organic compounds have been exhausted, and all that remains are the minerals in the bones, which do happen to provide a hard substrate for a reef to grow. For life after death in total darkness, 8 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology, and today I want to talk about this mysterious moving mud puddle in the middle of the desert. Located in Southern California alongside the equally spooky Salton Sea is a bubbling pool of mud that scientists can't explain. It's one of 33 mud pots and mud volcanoes that can be found on the south shore of the Salton Sea. They exist here because of the Wister Fault, which is an extension of or an abandoned branch of the Big San Andreas Fault, which extends across much of California. However, no mud pots in the world have moved as much as this strange anomaly. It's earned the nickname the Niland Geyser, even though it's not technically a geyser. It was first recorded in 1953, but it didn't start moving until 2016, when there was a series of earthquakes that might have jump-started it. Since then, it's moved some 20 feet per year, despite all of our efforts to stop it. In 2018, it was half the size of a football field and moving at 10 feet per month, straight towards the Union Pacific Railroad. Officials panicked, and the company built a 140-foot wide steel wall that was driven down into the earth the height of a 5-story building. They even tried to drill down to relieve some of the pressure, and this is when the Not Geyser lived up to its geyser name with a 100-foot high blowout. However, nothing that they did worked, and the mud puddle kept moving. To save the railroad, they had to build these temporary bypass tracks called shoe flies so that 70 trains per day could creep past the mud puddle. Over the next few years, it swallowed up a bunch of railroad tracks, but then it started to head towards the local highway. The state of California had to spend some $21 million to divert the highway away from this hungry mud puddle. But I know for this entire time you've been wondering to yourself, what would happen if I fell into this frothing water? Surprisingly, it might be the last thing you ever do because you'll probably die here. The main crater is around 25 feet deep, but that active bubbling area is much more shallow. However, you wouldn't be able to stand because you'd be surrounded by actively bubbling and gurgling mud that acts more like quicksand. Luckily, it's not hot because it's not geothermal, but all of those bubbles would reduce your buoyancy, making it difficult to swim, even as you're being sucked down into the quicksand mud. However, the real killer is that as you're flailing around and panicking, you're actively breathing in carbon dioxide gas. So you'd probably suffocate before you ever made it back to shore. 4 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology, and today I want to talk about the Surfer's Graveyard. This surfing hotspot is located on the Hawaiian Islands, specifically on the north shore of Oahu. There's a stretch of reef on this coastline that turns ordinary Pacific swells into towering hollow barrels that attract surfers from across the world. However, the most iconic spot along this coast is the Bonsai Pipeline. The largest waves are seen here in the winter when powerful storms churn across the North Pacific. These low-pressure systems generate strong, sustained winds that travel for thousands of miles across the open ocean, what surfers call fetch. That's why surfing was born in Polynesia and perfected in Hawaii. Riding waves was a sacred part of life known as hehe nalu. But on the Bonsai Pipeline today, that ancient relationship with the ocean meets the hubris of humankind. Since the 1960s, it's estimated that some 13 people have lost their lives here, which is how it's earned the reputation of being the most deadly surfing spot in the world. The waves here only average around 10 feet, but it can get up to around 30 during a particularly strong winter churn. However, the height of the wave isn't what makes this location so deadly. Beneath the surface is an incredibly shallow, jagged, and uneven rock reef. There's a maze of ridges, pockets, and caves that surfers can easily crash into. This rock shelf is what shapes the waves and makes pipelines so powerful. Luckily, I have an oceanographer friend who can explain it better.
Yes, hello, it's me. Just offshore lies a submerged shelf with a distinct stair-step bathymetry. The reefs form a gentle bow-shaped arc which refracts the energy of the waves onto one specific point on the coastline. It's this shape that creates the huge and hollow barrels the pipeline is known for. Some waves can roll over each step of the reef. They slowly become more powerful and steeper, ultimately detonating on that first reef. The waves might not be the largest on Earth, but it's the reef that makes pipeline the deadliest. 10-foot waves can break in 6 feet of water. When a surfer goes for a wave but misses the barrel, it's like being lifted 15 feet into the air and slammed straight onto concrete.
When you combine that with overcrowding and easy accessibility, pipeline is a disaster waiting to happen for most surfers. This is where human courage meets the ocean's indifference. 5 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology, and today I want to talk about the lake that actually inspired Spooky Lake Month. Tucked away in the Tian Shan Mountains of Kazakhstan, Lake Kaindy was formed after a massive earthquake in 1911. The earthquake killed over 400 people and destroyed almost 1,000 buildings in the area. It also caused a giant landslide, which effectively created a natural dam. Over time, the valley filled with water, creating a deep lake in the middle of the mountains. However, it also submerged hundreds of spruce trees. Over time, the upper half of the trees lost the majority of their needles and branches, resulting in these bleached stumps just sticking out of the water. The lake often appears to be this neon turquoise color because of a mineral-rich sediment called glacial flour. This sediment is formed when a glacier grinds over bedrock. As the glacier melts, this ultra-fine glacial flour flows down into streams and rivers. When the pulverized rock particles are then suspended in a lake, it reflects the sunlight and creates this turquoise color. However, it's mostly what lies below the surface that makes this lake so strange. The incredibly cold freshwater has prevented the bottom of the trees from decomposing. What you're seeing is trees that have been in this suspended animation for over 100 years. It's like a forest frozen in time, with branches that look like skeletal hands reaching out towards the divers. From the bleached stumps above to this fleshed out forest below, it's like a lake caught between two different worlds. A graveyard of preserved elderly trees that are honestly holding up better than most of us. 1 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology, and today I want to talk about flooded cemeteries. In 1972, Hurricane Agnes tore through the East Coast, resulting in flooding in Pennsylvania along the Susquehanna River. As floodwaters rose, the levees bordering the 44th Cemetery failed, unleashing the river across the graves. The cemetery was established in 1777 and has some of the region's oldest plots. Floodwaters washed away more than 2,700 caskets, burial vaults, and human remains. Bones and coffins were found on porches and rooftops and even in basements. By 1977, only around 1,400 of the missing graves were ever recovered. Many more were never seen again. Just last year, during construction near the cemetery, crews uncovered 35 headstones that had been lost since the flood. This is a story that's repeated itself throughout history, with water always being the quiet enemy to the grave. Floods, storms, and rising sea levels are not just affecting the living, they're also disturbing the dead. Around the world, especially along coastlines, cemeteries are vulnerable to the elements. However, it takes tremendous force to wrench a coffin from the ground, and not all water seeping into graveyards is violent. Even without a flood, water often finds its way into graves, especially older ones that weren't built with elaborate materials. Before the 20th century, most burials were just wooden coffins placed into the earth. When water does infiltrate a grave, it can either accelerate decomposition by turning tissues into fluid, or it can create a low oxygen environment that slows decay and preserves the remains. However, today, many graveyards require a liner or a vault for your coffin. It can vary in price, durability, and water resistance. If the ground of a cemetery becomes saturated, whether from heavy rain, flooding, or groundwater seepage, the vaults can cause a different kind of problem. With the right soil composition, extra water can liquefy the ground into mud. The pressure that used to hold the coffin and vault down suddenly disappears. Air trapped in the vaults combined with decomposition gases in the coffin create a kind of buoyancy effect. Sometimes a coffin or vault will just raise a few inches under the earth before settling again. Other times, if the grave was heavily saturated and the burial was shallow, it can actually pop back to the surface. Wet graveyards have always been a problem, but with each heavier rain and subsequent flood, an eternal resting place doesn't feel so eternal. 6 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month, where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology. Today, I want to talk about water cremation, an alternative to traditional burial that intentionally liquefies the dead. When a body is buried in the United States, it's often first pumped full of chemicals, then placed inside of a casket before being entombed in a concrete vault. Its death wrapped in layers of plastic, wood, metal, concrete, and good intentions. However, embalming involves formaldehyde, a known carcinogen that even embalmers who have to handle it need to wear protective gear. And yet, every year, hundreds of thousands of gallons of this ends up in the ground. And because water so often seeps into graves, the embalming fluid doesn't always stay put. It can leach out into the soil and the groundwater around it. Yes, we can be grateful that embalming fluid no longer contains arsenic. Cremation seems greener, no casket, no vault. But cremation requires sustained temperatures of 1,400 to 1,800 degrees for 90 minutes to 2 hours. Most crematoriums run on natural gas, but each cremation takes as much energy as driving your car 500 to 1,000 miles. It can also release mercury, carbon dioxide, and dioxins into the air. Also, if you didn't know, what's left isn't ashes, but instead bone fragments that are ground into ashes. This brings us to alkaline hydrolysis, also called water cremation or aqua cremation. Instead of fire, it uses water, heat, and an alkaline solution. This essentially speeds up the same natural chemical reactions that occur when a body decomposes underground. The body is placed inside of a pressurized steel vessel that's about 95% water and 5% alkali. There's no acid involved, more like the opposite. Instead, it's highly alkaline, which is like a extremely concentrated soap. What's left behind is a sterile liquid that's mostly made of water, amino acids, and salts. It goes through our wastewater system, treated just like anything else that goes down the drain. The other thing left behind is soft bone fragments that are usually dried and then returned to the family. The process has been around for decades, used in medical fields and veterinary practices, but it's only legalized for humans in about half of the United States. Environmentally, it's one of the lowest impact ways to return a body to the earth, or in this case, to the water. This might be your best bet for becoming spooky good soup in the afterlife. 3 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month, where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology. and today I want to talk about a volcanic lake in the Philippines. Taal Lake is located on Luzon, the largest of the some 8,000 islands that make up the Philippines. Taal Lake is considered a recursive lake because it's a lake on an island in the ocean with an island with a lake on it that also has an island on it. The lake that appears in the belly of this active volcano is sulfurous and sometimes acidic with toxic gases that bubble up to the surface. Around it spreads the vast Taal Lake, which formed in a collapsed caldera during an ancient eruption that happened here. The majority of the eruptions occur in the crater on the island, and even though it has a modest profile, it's one of the most volatile volcanoes in the world. Taal Lake used to be connected to the sea, and marine life would flow between the lake and the open ocean. Today, it's home to one of the only venomous freshwater sea snakes. The volcano is notoriously unpredictable. Sometimes earthquakes will rumble for weeks, hinting at an eruption that never comes. But then sometimes, like in 1965, it can erupt in the middle of the night with no warning at all. Roughly 1 million people live within 10 miles of the Taal volcano, and some 6,000 people lived on the volcanic island in the middle of the lake until 2020. After 40 years of quiet in January of 2020, the Taal volcano woke up in a dramatic fashion. There was widespread ash, spewing lava, and volcanic lightning. The initial eruption lasted for 14 hours and displaced some 500,000 people. The crater lake in the center of the volcano vaporized during the eruption, but eventually refilled over time. The plume of ash was over 9 miles high and affected a region of over 13 million people. One thing to appreciate is that this ash wasn't soft and fluffy. It was made of jagged rock and piercing glass. It's sharp, acidic, and mildly corrosive, so when you inhale it, it can actually slice up your lung tissue. Rain turned the ash into a muddy slurry, which then dried into a concrete-like crust. Roofs collapsed, crops died, and entire towns disappeared underneath this gray mud. Volcanic Island itself was completely altered by this eruption, and now it's illegal to live there. Lastly, I'm not really one to talk about true crime, but Taal Lake has recently become the focus of a grim investigation. In the search for 34 men who went missing some 3 years ago, police divers uncovered sacks at the bottom of the lake containing human remains. The lake itself has been difficult to search because it's incredibly deep, there's been recent volcanic activity, and there's venomous water snakes. This is still an open investigation, and no one knows who these skeletons belong to yet. Fire, ash, and now bones. This lake has a history of death. 6 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month, where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology, and today I want to talk about that one time that we dumped 2 million tires into the ocean. Off the coast of Fort Lauderdale, Florida, lies a haunting monument to good intentions that has gone totally wrong. By the 1970s, the US was discarding around 200 million used tires each year, and landfills were overflowing. At the same time, artificial reefs were all the rage, and Florida decided to kill 2 birds with 1 stone by getting rid of their tire problem and helping the ocean. By 1972, the Osborne Tire Reef project was approved, and they bundled together almost 2 million old tires using steel wire and nylon straps. Tires were loaded onto barges where they took them about a mile offshore and dropped them into 70 feet of water. A Goodyear blimp even flew overhead and dropped a golden tire to christen the new reef. It only took a few years for people to start realizing what a bad idea this was. Saltwater corroded the steel fastenings, and the tires came apart and began floating around the ocean floor. Every storm that came through rolled the tires like bowling balls, smashing into coral, destroying actual natural reef, and smothering marine life in rubber. Also, as these tires deteriorate, they release trace amounts of heavy metals and hydrocarbons into the surrounding ocean. By the 1990s, hurricanes were washing tens of thousands of these tires onto Florida beaches. Cleanup began in 2001, but it was painfully slow and expensive. Divers removed around 1,700 tires at a cost of $17 per tire. It was estimated that it would cost some $30 million to remove all 2 million tires. The US military did try to help, and by 2009, 70,000 tires were removed successfully. Since then, private contractors and environmental groups like 4Ocean have worked to remove the tires one load at a time. However, estimates say there could be between 700,000 and 1 million of these tires still residing on the sea floor. This graveyard of rubber ghosts that have haunted the Florida coastline for more than half a century is 5 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology. Today, I want to talk about this giant tank of water that's buried inside of a mountain and designed to listen to ghost particles. It's called the Super Kaminokonde Neutrino Detector, or Super K for short, and it's located in the Hida Mountains in Japan inside of an old zinc mine. Constructed in 1991, it sits more than 3,000 feet below the surface, and it's surrounded by solid rock. The tank is the height of the Statue of Liberty, and it can fit more than 13 million gallons of ultra-pure water. The walls are lined with more than 11,000 of these photomultiplier tubes, which are essentially hand-blown giant glass bulbs that could cost around $3,000 a piece. These golden eyes stare into the water in pitch black, waiting for a singular flicker of light caused from an invisible particle called a neutrino. Trillions of these ghost-like particles are passing through you every second, pouring in from the sun, from dying stars, or from cosmic rays that are striking the Earth's atmosphere. They rarely interact with matter, most flying straight through the planet as if it's not even there. But once in a while, a neutrino will collide with a water molecule in this underground lake. The impact causes this tiny flash of blue light called Cherenkov radiation, which is the same glow you see in nuclear reactors. Scientists study neutrinos to understand the birth of stars and the origins of matter, and maybe even why the universe exists at all. But let's be honest, I don't really understand any of that. I just want to talk about how weird the water is inside of this tank. The water at the Super K neutrino detector is so pure that it's kinda dangerous. The water is being filtered within an inch of its life, continuously being scrubbed of particulates, dust, microbes, down to the sub-micron level. It's stripped of nearly every dissolved ion, salt, and metal, and a degassing system sucks out all of the dissolved oxygen, carbon dioxide, and radon. What's left is this ultra-pure water that's chemically aggressive. It's desperate to dissolve anything it touches just so that it can restore a chemical balance. People often lump distilled, deionized, and ultra-pure water together, but the water at Super K neutrino detector is just on a whole nother level of clean. This level of purity is unnatural. Water this clean doesn't exist anywhere else on Earth. Ultra-pure water is H2O molecules only. It's hydrogen and oxygen and nothing else. When it comes in contact with the air, it does try to absorb gases that are around it, so it can become impure just from being in the open air. There's a story about how in the year 2000 they drained the tank for maintenance and they found the ghostly outline of a wrench at the bottom. Over the course of 5 years, the water had eaten the metal and dissolved it to nothing. Unlike the wrench, you're not going to dissolve if you fall into this tank, but it would still be hungry for your skin. It would nibble at your oils and salts and mucous membranes, stinging your mouth and your eyes. Your skin would be painfully dry until you got out and rinsed off. It's kind of like being aggressively exfoliated. Scientists here wear full protective gear when they get in the dreamboat. They wear coveralls, gloves, and masks to protect themselves, but also to protect the water. It's so clean that a few drops of sweat or skin oil can contaminate the entire tank. Repurifying it would take months and cost millions of dollars, so if you fell in, not only would you be itchy, but you'd also be the problem. It's also not meant to be consumed. Ultra-pure water is the water that wants to drink you right back. A sip won't kill you, but it could make your mouth feel raw like you ate too many sour gummies. If you drank too much, it would deplete your electrolytes and cause your cells to swell, which also happens with normal water, but this just happens faster. That's why this tank isn't for people, it's for ghost particles from outer space. 4 out of 10 spookies. Man, I didn't even mention the fact that over 6,000 of these bulbs imploded in 2001. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology. And today I want to talk about one of the most radioactive places on Earth, which is a lake in Russia. After the atomic bombs fell on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, World War II ended, but the nuclear arms race was just beginning. The Soviet Union built one of the largest nuclear facilities deep in the Ural Mountains. It was called Mayak. This was a secret location that didn't show up on any maps, where Soviets produced plutonium for their first atomic bombs. Scientists who worked there were never allowed to leave, and the nuclear reactors were built by Gulag prisoners without any protection. When Mayak started to churn out radioactive waste, no one quite knew what to do with it. They started by dumping it in the nearby Techa River, which was a water source for multiple nearby villages. When the river became too obviously contaminated, they needed somewhere new to dump this waste, and they chose Lake Karachay. From this point on, every image you see of this lake is going to look different because for over 16 years it served as Mayak's nuclear trash pit. Between 1951 and 1967, they dumped an estimated 120 million curies of radioactive waste into Lake Karachay. Some scientists say that by the 1960s, Lake Karachay held more radiation than Chernobyl, not scattered across a country, but instead concentrated in a single toxic basin. The liquid waste contains cesium-137, strontium-90, and plutonium isotopes, which settled into the lake's mud and sediments. By the 1990s, if you just stood on the shore of Lake Karachay for an hour, you would get a lethal dose of radiation. Lake Karachay wasn't even the only disaster that happened at the Mayak facility. 29 years before the Chernobyl meltdown, an underground waste tank exploded here, releasing radiation fallout for more than 20,000 square miles. This radioactive cloud of hot particles affected some 270,000 people, and while some people were evacuated within a week, others weren't evacuated for up to 2 years after this disaster. The Russian government kept it secret for over 20 years, but today it's considered one of the worst nuclear disasters that's ever happened in human history. Disaster struck again in 1967 when, after an unusually dry winter, there was a scorching summer that evaporated the water in Lake Karachay. This exposed the dry radioactive mud at the bottom of the lake, and when the wind picked up, it became radioactive flying dust. It contaminated thousands of square miles and possibly sickened tens of thousands of people. After that, the Soviet government began to slowly but surely fill Lake Karachay in with concrete blocks. The cleanup took decades, partly because of the fall of the Soviet Union, but also because of just how dangerous it was to be on the shore of this lake. It wasn't until 2016 that the lake was finally filled with concrete blocks, rocks, and dirt, essentially converting it into a dry nuclear storage facility. The multi-layer barrier is meant to trap contaminated sediments at the bottom. However, it's a system that will require maintenance indefinitely. And considering that some of the waste down there has a half-life of 24,000 years, Lake Karachay is going to outlive humanity as we know it. 10 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology. And today I want to talk about lakes that are actually just ticking time bombs. Not including the ice sheets on Greenland and Antarctica, there are some 215,000 glaciers across the planet. Glaciers are living, breathing rivers of ice that move, crack, and shape the ground beneath them. Proglacial lakes form at the end of a glacier, where meltwater collects behind a wall of ice, rock, and debris. This glacially built dam is called a terminal moraine, and it's the only thing holding the lake in place. And it's not exactly stable because it's made from whatever the glacier decided to drop off as it melted: clay, loose gravel, ice, or rock. Glaciers mostly melt in the summer, but even in the winter, pressure and friction keep some parts melting from within. The water flows both across the surface, but also beneath the ice, slowly but surely making its way into the glacial lake at the bottom. That means these lakes are in a precarious position, filling with more water each season and putting more pressure against that fragile earthen dam. When a dam gives out, all of that trapped water rushes out in a sudden, violent flood. Scientists call this a glacial lake outburst flood, and it can happen for a variety of reasons. Heavy rain, a rock slide, or an avalanche, or even a piece of the glacier crashing into the lake, causing water to go sloshing across the surface. When the dam breaks, a surge of water rips an opening into the earth, and as more water follows, that gap widens, allowing the entire lake to eventually drain through the opening. Depending on the type of dam, whether it's made from rock or ice, this could either take minutes or it could take days. Everything downstream gets hit with a wall of rock, mud, blocks of ice, and freezing water. Some of the largest floods in Earth's history have come from glacial lake outbursts, such as the Missoula floods, which literally reshaped the entire Pacific Northwest. Over 12,000 people have died in floods like these, and it's only going to get worse as our glaciers continue to melt. We can see this happening in Alaska near the city of Juneau. The Mendenhall Glacier has retreated almost 2 miles since the early 1900s. It's pulled back so far that a side valley that was once covered in ice is now filling with water. We call it the Suicide Basin, and it's prone to glacial lake outbursts. For months, the basin fills quietly, holding back 15 billion gallons of water behind a dam made of ice. But every summer since 2011, it's released one or more floods into the valley below. The most recent of these floods happened in August of this year, where the Mendenhall River rose by over 16 feet in a matter of hours. The river tore through neighborhoods, uprooted trees, and ripped houses right off of their foundation. While residents were able to evacuate in time, these types of floods can be incredibly unpredictable and dangerous. And with the planet warming, we can only expect to see more of them in the years ahead. 6 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month, where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology. And today, I want to talk about the killer Kern. The Kern River is infamous for this roadside sign that tracks how many people have died here, and they keep it up to date. As of 2025, 342 lives have been lost, including 7 additional lives between January and May of this year. The river winds through Southern California, draining straight from Mount Whitney, the highest peak in the lower 48. It used to flow all the way into Tulare Lake, the zombie lake that haunts California's Central Valley. Mostly gone today, but sometimes it's resurrected. Most of the Kern River is hijacked by the California Aqueduct, honestly spooky in its own right. The upper Kern cuts through the granite rock at the heart of the Sierra Nevada mountains, where through one of its tributaries it's carved these strange circular basins known as the 7 teacups. This section is a little hard to get to, but it's known for its swirling hydraulics. One in particular is known as the toilet bowl. It's claimed multiple lives in recent years, partly because it's a popular canyoneering site. Just 2 months ago, a man who was experienced in canyoneering accidentally got stuck behind a waterfall for 3 days. He was rescued, but unfortunately not everybody is so lucky. Last year, a woman who was climbing the 7 teacups unclipped her gear and dropped into an 8-foot deep pool at the end of the trail. Immediately caught in an unexpected whirlpool, likely caused by a rock or log that was lodged invisible beneath the surface. 2 of her fellow climbers jumped in after her, but both of them were caught in the deadly whirlpool, and none of them survived. However, most of the deaths here occur further down the river, where there are popular swimming holes and rapids. Depending on the river's flow, which rises with snowmelt and storms, the calm current can transform into an absolute monster. Every summer, a combination of freezing water, submerged currents, and hidden obstacles create a deadly trap for swimmers, kayakers, and rafters. The minute you even step into the river, your life expectancy drops. The killer Kern can look calm from the shore, but it will pull you under in seconds and drag you down the river. 95% of the river's victims were not wearing safety gear when they should have been, or they were consuming alcohol while on the water. The Kern River isn't so different than hundreds of other rivers like it across the United States. However, its cool waters are extremely popular on hot summer days in Southern California, and people underestimate it. Each summer, thousands of people flock to this inviting canyon, and while most leave with memories, some never leave at all. It may not be unique, but its popularity makes it one of the deadliest rivers in North America. 4 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month, where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology, and today we finally need to talk about the Great Blue Hole. Located around 40 miles off the coast of Belize in the Caribbean Sea lies a sinkhole so large that it can actually be seen from space. It sits within the Lighthouse Reef, which is really a coral atoll that makes up part of Belize's barrier reef system. The sinkhole is one of the deepest in the world of its kind. It's over 1,000 feet across and more than 400 feet deep. It was formed when a giant limestone cave system collapsed and eventually flooded when the sea levels rose during the last ice age. There's evidence of this in the stalactites that still hang from the walls, a reminder that this abyss wasn't always underwater. The Blue Hole was popularized as a diving site by Jacques Cousteau, who visited here in 1971 with his research vessel, the Calypso. For the past 50 years, the Blue Hole has drawn divers from around the world to explore its coral reef system that's teeming with life, but the bottom remained somewhat of a mystery until recently. In 2018, an expedition using a submersible explored and mapped out the bottom of the Blue Hole for the first time. As the team descended into the darkness, they encountered a strange milky layer around 295 feet below the surface. This would have looked similar to the Angelina cenote in Mexico, except for now imagine it in pitch darkness. They had encountered hydrogen sulfide gas, which we normally think of as toxic and corrosive, but now it's dissolved in the water, creating a deadly chemical layer. Over thousands of years, everything that ever fell into the hole ended up decomposing, absorbing all of the oxygen and creating an anoxic, toxic zone. The gas blankets the entire bottom of the Blue Hole, and no sea life intentionally passes through the gas without dying. That means that anything that drops below this layer is now going to be preserved, with no oxygen to fuel the decay. The expedition discovered old scientific equipment, GoPros, Coke bottles, and an entire graveyard of conch shells that were now covered in a thin layer of silt. However, that wasn't all they discovered in this endless abyss. The team also came across the preserved remains of 2 divers. Over the last century, at least 3 divers have disappeared in the Blue Hole, but their identities were never released, and we can't say for sure that they were the only ones. We now know where 2 of the bodies remain, but they won't be removed from this watery grave because it was deemed too dangerous to retrieve them. That means that divers visiting the Blue Hole today are unknowingly swimming above their preserved remains. 7 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month, where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology. And today, I want to talk about cities that we intentionally flood. There are nearly 60,000 large dams on Earth, many of which are holding back enormous reservoirs of water that swallowed up entire river valleys, cities, and ancient architecture. Homes, histories, and even graves now lie beneath the water, with sometimes only the rooftops, towers, and church spires peeking out above the surface. It's only when drought drains these reservoirs that ghost towns emerge, their streets and walls briefly coming up for air. We usually think of these long-lost cities as myths or legends hidden beneath the surface, but even now new dams are being built and new ghost towns are being created. This time, history is repeating itself in the mountains on the coasts of the Black Sea in Turkey. Completed in 2022 after nearly a decade of construction, the Yusufeli Dam rises 886 feet above the Charco River. Designed for hydroelectricity, the Yusufeli Dam can generate more than 500 megawatts of power, which supports more than 100,000 people living in Turkey. It's one of the largest dams of its kind in the world, and it's only the second out of 13 planned dams for this river. The reservoir filled in a little less than a year, submerging the river valley and forcing over 7,000 people to evacuate before the water reached their doors. An enormous city center and 7 small villages were slowly subsumed by the rising waters. In the town of Yusufeli, no wrecking crews came. Homes weren't demolished and streets weren't bulldozed. Instead, hundreds of buildings were left standing. Their hollow shells, along with any other trash or debris left behind, were slowly swallowed by the reservoir, 1 inch at a time. The people of Yusufeli stood on the hillsides and watched as their homes, schools, churches, mosques, and memories disappeared beneath the water. The city was only around a century old, but people had been living in this valley for over 1,000 years. Residents were relocated to a newly constructed town higher up on the mountain that overlooks the one they left behind. But the new town does feel kind of like suburbia, with identical matching buildings, scrubbed clean of the identity that used to make the Yusufeli under the water feel unique. Maybe you're more prone to nightmares about drowned, long-forgotten cities, but I find something deeply unnerving about a fresh kill that has yet to decay. 9 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month, where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology. And today, I want to talk about the largest ship graveyard in the world. Chuuk Lagoon, which was also once called Truk Lagoon, is a coral-covered atoll in Micronesia that's basically completely surrounded by the Pacific Ocean. Beneath these turquoise waters lie over 60 shipwrecks and hundreds of airplanes, most of which sank on a single fateful day in 1944. During World War II, the Empire of Japan seized control of this lagoon, turning it into their largest military base in the South Pacific, also forcing the local Chuukese people to work under harsh military rule. Entire communities were horribly treated while also being uprooted to make way for airstrips, oil storage, and submarine pens, all for an empire preparing for war. Following Pearl Harbor, the United States began striking back across the Pacific Ocean, eventually setting their sights on the stronghold at Chuuk Lagoon. In February of 1944, the U.S. Navy launched Operation Hailstone, a 2-day bombardment that turned the lagoon into a sea of fire and wreckage. Thousands of Japanese soldiers died as bombs rained down, ships exploded, and aircrafts fell from the sky. Today, their skeletal remains can be found at the bottom of this shallow sea, draped in coral with their rusted hulls slowly giving way to the elements. The site is now a popular diving destination, with people coming from around the world to see the wrecks, along with a litany of World War II artifacts. Divers come face to face with relics from the war, anything from ammunition and tanks to gas masks and sake bottles, and even human remains. The skeletons at Chuuk Lagoon are actually at the heart of a lingering controversy. Japan has recovered some of its dead, but many more still remain amongst the wreckage. It's both a gravesite and a playground for divers, many of whom took home souvenirs in the early days, including human bones. Japan still wants to bring its soldiers home, but these wrecks are also the main source of tourism for the Chuukese people. Many divers come hoping to glimpse these skeletons. It's the thing that makes these dives unique. There's a fragile balance occurring here between honoring the dead and surviving the present. However, both the bones and the wrecks are slowly disappearing, being eaten away by time, salt, and the ever-persistent sea. And these rusted hulls pose a different kind of problem. Thousands of gallons of oil that is slowly leaking into the lagoon. There are more than 8,500 World War II shipwrecks that are scattered across the globe, many of which are on the brink of leaking oil. As they slowly rust and decay, oil sneaks out of ruptured fuel tanks, a slow-motion environmental disaster. Just last month, a state of emergency was declared as one of these deteriorating hulls started to leak oil in the Chuuk Lagoon. This is a problem we're going to see more and more in the coming years as these World War II wrecks continue to corrode. Even though the war ended 80 years ago, it still lingers here, in the haunted wrecks below and in the oil-slicked surface above. 10 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's Spooky Lake Month where we're doing 31 days of haunted hydrology, and today I want to talk about something that crashed into a frozen lake in Kazakhstan in 1976. Lake Tengiz is the largest lake in northern Kazakhstan, and on October 16th of that year, there was a blizzard raging over its frozen surface. During the storm, locals could hear the low hum of helicopters circling overhead. What they didn't know is there were 2 Soviet cosmonauts trapped in a space capsule beneath the frozen surface of the lake. And luckily I have a space friend who can explain what happened.
Yes, surprise, it's me. On October 14th, 1976, the Soviet spacecraft Soyuz 23 lifted off from the Baikonur Cosmodrome. They were headed for the Salyut 5, which was the Soviet Union's military space station. The plan was for a 73-day mission. This was a long stay meant to continue the work of former crews, but they never made it inside. As the capsule approached, its automatic docking system failed. The crew of 2 had trained to perform a manual docking, but not a manual approach. The mission had to be abandoned, and the cosmonauts were left drifting in orbit waiting for a chance to return home. With only 2 days of battery power left, the cosmonauts powered off most of the systems in the spacecraft, and they waited for the landing window the next day. The plan was to land back near the Baikonur Cosmodrome, which was the usual recovery site. However, a violent blizzard had rolled across Kazakhstan, and when they re-entered Earth's atmosphere on October 16, 1976, they descended through thick clouds completely blind.
Instead of solid ground, they slammed into the frozen waters of Lake Tengiz around 5 miles from the shore. Impact drove the parachute into the icy water, which resulted in the capsule being pulled down with it. Splash triggered the backup parachute, which then tangled around the spacecraft, jamming the hatch and blocking the radio antennas. So the capsule was now underwater and rescuers had no idea where it was. Inside the capsule, the 2 cosmonauts were shivering in near total darkness as the temperatures dropped below 0. Hours went by and oxygen was running low as carbon dioxide started to build up inside of the small cabin. At this point, they had assumed that the cosmonauts were dead, and they decided to resume the search for their bodies in the morning. After 11 hours, divers were dropped by a helicopter where they finally discovered the wreck, attached flotation devices to the side of it so that it could be lifted to the surface. Both of the cosmonauts were alive but unconscious and covered in a layer of frost. If the rescue had taken just an hour longer, it's possible that neither man would have survived. A mission intended for the stars ended under the ice in a frozen lake. 5 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello, it's the last day of Spooky Lake Month, and we always end the month with Lake Superior. And this year we're doing something a little bit special because it's been 50 years since the wreck of the Edmund Fitzgerald. So let's talk about the legend that lives on, the greatest maritime mystery of the Great Lakes, and what happened on November 10th, 1975. Lake Superior is the largest of the North American Great Lakes, and it has more water than all of the other lakes combined. There's some 500 shipwrecks in Lake Superior and more than 10,000 people who have died here. And by far the most iconic of these shipwrecks is the Edmund Fitzgerald, one of the largest iron ore freighters to ever traverse these waters. Some say she was cursed from the first moment she set sail in 1958, when it took 3 tries to break the celebratory champagne bottle over her hull, and someone died in the crowd of a heart attack when the ship went into the water. Despite this grim beginning, the ship carried iron ore across the Great Lakes for 17 years. Until 1975. Lake Superior is known for having strange weather in November when cold, dry Arctic air collides with the still warm, moist air that's lingering over the lake. This intense temperature difference fuels powerful low-pressure systems that generate hurricane-force winds, towering waves, and blowing snow. Also, unlike the oceans, freshwater freezes fast and it can completely coat a ship in solid ice. Sailors call it the Witch of November, and it's the type of storm that's been claiming ships on the Great Lakes for over a century. And these were the conditions that the Edmund Fitzgerald faced on its last day above the surface. The ship left Superior, Wisconsin on November 9th, 1975, carrying a full load of iron ore with a storm predicted to pass south of Lake Superior. The Edmund Fitzgerald was traveling in tandem with another freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, and in the middle of the night, the storm unexpectedly shifted north, straight into their path. Through howling 86-mile-per-hour winds, blowing snow, and 30-foot waves, the two ships kept in touch until the end. No distress signal was ever sent, and the last message from the Edmund Fitzgerald was simply, "We are holding our own." After that, she disappeared off of the radar. All 29 crew members vanished on that fateful November night. To this day, we don't know what happened. Why did this ship go down in conditions that it had faced many times before? Did she nosedive into the depths or hit a hidden shoal, or did she break apart on the surface before plunging to the bottom? Some say it was a rogue wave or an unsecured cargo hatch that let water pour in. Maybe it was just a fatal weakness in her design, but none of these theories have ever been proven, and the mystery lives on. The wreck was discovered 17 miles north of Whitefish Bay on a stretch of Lake Superior known as the Graveyard of the Great Lakes. The lake's incredibly cold, oxygen-poor waters have preserved the wreck, along with some of the crew members that are still inside. However, since 2006, the Edmund Fitzgerald has been designated as an official gravesite, and no one can disturb the wreck or her dead. So what we know now about what happened on November 10th, 1975 might be all we ever know. The rest of the story remains with the dead at the bottom of Lake Superior. 10 out of 10 spookies. Yes, hello. It's no longer Spooky Lake Month since we did 31 days of haunted hydrology. See you next year.